Good morning. I'm giving a commentary on the second last lecture, The Foundations of Esotericism, lecture 30. It's been some time to prepare this little talk. It's quite a complex lecture, but it's a far-reaching lecture of Steiner, which could be called The Future of Nourishment. It follows the central turnaround point in our time. We have to remember that there's a whole lot of language that we need to get around in this. In Steiner, he uses the word root race and sub-race. We see these as big cultural evolutionary periods with 7 cultural epochs. So in our time, we have come to what is known as the post-Atlantean time with 7 cultural epochs. And that is the 5th in our major part of evolution. And he talks about how certain images in biblical traditions, so for example Cain and Abel or the Last Supper, give us indications as to where the process of how we take in things from the earth, the wisdom from the earth, have changed. So he talks about how there was a time where the human being in ancient Lemuria would take their nourishment from milk, a kind of a moon gesture which Lemuria has, and that these were the able people who were still shepherds, who would nourish themselves from the sort of the cosmic nourishment of milk. And then the next step would be, for example, what Cain did was to till the soil and produce plants, and that there was a time where that was in conflict. But as we progress more and more into the material world, our nourishment becomes more and more earthly. So there's a third step where we then obviously partake in the eating of meat. And finally, well, not finally, but in the 4th step, there's a step of taking the mineral in, so taking the salts and the minerals out of the earth. So we go from a sort of a cosmic nourishment out of the milk, from that which is given to us from the gods through the animals, and then the plants, and then the meat eaters, and then also adding the minerals of the earth. And then he says there's a time which kind of comes in the center of our earth, of our major post-Atlantean time, the time where we have to start adding to those, and he calls it the chemical addition. This is announced to us in the post-Atlantean time with Noah. So when Noah, the story of Noah comes as a thing that he partakes, he starts to grow grapes and develops wine. So the chemical reaction into that which is given to us of the earth is a step that has also been taken, and a necessary step, that we have to develop our food. So if we go into the post-Atlantean times of developing things like, we see in many cultural stories that there is the presentation of bread, or transforming the grasses and the plants through chemical reaction in bread and wine, epitomized in Central Europe. But there are many cultures where the goddess gives us the bread, and then also the alcoholic drink that accompanies it in many rituals, sort of cake and ale or bread and wine in the Last Supper, are a step away from that. So we have to see that we have gone to a process where we have come quite deeply into the physical nourishment, and then we've gone into the chemical process, which was announced in Europe through the Dionysian rituals 700 years before Christ, through Noah, and that now in our time we have to add food through a chemical process. Now this is how we talk about that alcohol did not exist in Atlantis, but through the work of alcohol, through the process of chemical reactions in food, we've taken a deeper step into the physical world and the transformation of the physical world. So this is why those bread and wine, or some form of the chemical transformation of the plants in both solid and liquid foods, have played a central role in ritual, as it was important for our time for us to do that. And then he starts to explain a little bit what the step was. That the next step, for example, will be that we need to turn wine again into water. So this is where the accounts of the Gospels of Christ's journey, for example, he turns water into wine. That's an acknowledgement that he's living in that central Semitic Greco-Roman age, that it was a necessary time of the nourishment of people to do that. But now that needed to be transformed a further step, and that the sacrament of the Last Supper is a real step that through transforming, if we look at the process of Christ's journey, he starts his journey of transforming water into wine, but then he also transforms at the Last Supper wine, or these chemically transformed bread and wine, into body and blood. Now, we can go through a whole critique of that. That's not literal flesh of a human being and not literal blood of a human being, but it is the body and the blood of the earth. And that through through the crucifixion, we then see that the blood of Jesus is transformed into water again. So there's a process, there's a mystical process in the story of the process of the nourishment of the physical body, how the human being can nourish themselves out of the four realms of the cosmic, of the milk, and then the plant and the animal and the mineral, and that now we've also gone through the process of transforming certain aspects of those through the chemical processes. But he also then says that we through the stories of the Christ being, as the mythological, so the earlier mythological stories were that of Noah, of Dionysus, but in the Christ mystery of the biblical stories of the Last Supper, we see a deep mystery ingrained into the mythological pictures, into the symbolic pictures of the transformation of where our nourishment should come from. So at first Christ acknowledges, yes, we are in that place where we use chemistry or the chemical reaction in the plant world. There will come a time where we need to move beyond that as well, where we transform these things back into a more cosmic aspect of nourishment. And then there's a wonderful riddle that he talks about how in the future another form of nourishment will have to be developed by the human being, that as we progress in unfolding out of our higher self, the transformation of our sheaths, we will start to add another layer and further layers of where we nourish ourselves from. So he says the significance of the Last Supper is the transition from nourishment taken from the dead animal to nourishment taken from the dead plant. So we're going back up, that there were people at that time that were nourishing themselves from dead animals, and now through the Christ mystery, that the Christ mystery was given at the Last Supper, was using bread and wine, which are plant-based food, but through the chemical reaction and then through the transformation of that into a higher form of sustenance. But then he says in our next we are now in our fifth sort of cultural epoch, in this great time after Atlantis. This is in the next cultural epoch, so in a couple of thousand years from now, we will really start to understand what this mystery means to nourish ourselves from bread and wine, but also to add something. A third form of nourishment will start to take its appearance, which he says is the purely mineral. He says the human being will then be able to create our own nourishment. Today we take what the gods or the spiritual world have created for us, we transform that, but later we will have to advance within ourselves to prepare for ourselves the substances we require in the chemical laboratory. That might be quite confronting for us who are trying to nourish ourselves healthily through natural food, but to consider that there'll come a time where the human being will have to create the forms of nourishment within us. So where we see that which Christ kills, which was actually sacrificed after he had partaken of the Last Supper, is the physical body. So the physical body dies, but we need to start nourishing towards us in the last third, so maybe about 4,000 or 5,000 years from now, we will no longer have a physical body, and then the entire human will again be in the etheric. And we need to start nourishing ourselves from a finer substance. We must pass over into the nourishment which we have prepared for ourselves in the laboratory. So we will no longer partake of nourishment from nature, but gains from our own wisdom, from the divine, from the spiritual, from the God within us. and so far do we hasten towards our own deification. So that's a really interesting, confronting and puzzling aspect about where nourishment would be heading. Certainly, if we look at our current world that we're living in, we can see that there are more and more processes of where nourishment are coming out of laboratories rather than out of natural foods. This may at first not be a positive thing, but there are definitely protein shakes and diet shakes where all these nourishments are just created in a laboratory. We just add water, and then we have a meal. So is that already a foreshadowing of what this means, or is it a negative presentation for those of us who try to live out of transforming the plant world through a sacramental way of nourishing ourselves? And with sacrament, I don't just mean church sacrament, I mean the way we prepare food and bless it and prepare it and add the chemicals and raise it to a higher spiritual state through the way we eat it is quite confronting to think that we also need to go to another level. This lecture is quite confusing in its direction because of the language that he's using in the theosophical and the Eastern esoteric sense. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. But yeah, there's really a definite sense that where he now, towards the end of this lecture, repeats a certain sense that since the middle of Atlantis, the fifth cultural epoch of Atlantis was known as the ancient or the original Semitic nation, and we see that in our fourth, so from that time through the end of Atlantis to the center of the Greco-Roman Semitic cultural epoch is a certain unfolding. In our time, we are in the fruits of that. In our fifth epoch, we are living out, developing the fruits of that developmental phase from the original Semitic in the Atlantic through the Semitic Greco-Roman time where that came to a certain fruition, and now we live the fruits of that. But that in our next cultural epoch, the sixth one, we will prepare out of the East, out of the Slavonic races, the next developmental phase where these higher forms of nutrition or these other forms of nutrition need to be developed. And as I said, the cultural question would be when we look at things like climate change, the loss of habitat, the loss of capacity of the earth to produce natural food for people. Are we going to need to head towards already eating and nourishing ourselves out of laboratory created foods? It's certainly a direction that Steiner indicated that would be necessary. So quite a deep and confronting thought to contemplate. How do we go about that? He doesn't necessarily say that it's something for our time, but there's always these overlaps between what's to come in the future and already the seed forms of it being developed now in a particular time. So we can definitely see a confronting consideration of this idea. He then also ends this lecture by talking about some social impulses of East and West. Again, these lectures are very dense and some of the themes overlap, but he talks about how the socializing forces or the culturally creating social forces come at the moment, and there's a contradiction between the socialism of the East and the West. This was 100 years ago, of course, but he talks about the socialism of the West, and when he talks about that, he's talking about Karl Marx, even though we think Marxism is an Eastern philosophy because it was taken up in Russia, but it's actually a Western philosophy. So the socialism of the West is one of production, where the human being is only, or the worker is only considered in as far as they can produce something, whereas the socialism of the East, with the Eastern thinkers, some thinkers here may not be known to you, but for example, he talks of Kropotkin, where Kropotkin understands the principle of cooperation, of mutual assistance, for example, as we find in the forces of evolution, which is slightly different to what Darwin talked about. Darwin's, again, we come to this idea of what is Steiner's understanding of evolution. It's not that of natural selection. It's not that of the survival of fitness, but it's emerging evolution or emergent evolution through cooperation, and that's a really powerful new voice, or a revision of that voice in evolution theory at the moment, is what is the role of cooperation between species in evolution, in surviving and developing new. And he says that the socialism of the East really understands is a socialism of consumption. So where we look at a social life out of what the needs of the people are, to be the consumer. So we say socialism of the West is entirely built on strife, whereas that of the East is that of cooperation or mutual assistance. So as we move into the future, we will have to look to that as well, where we can move into the future seeds out of the East, out of the Slavonic people, where our social world, our economic world needs to be based upon cooperation again. Where do we find that emerging today? Are there places where the social impulse is being developed out of cooperation rather out of strife and production and the sale of labor rather than offering, he talked about earlier how our work was at first in tribute, it was slave labor. We've moved now into the sale of labor, where we just sell our work. But in the future, when we cooperate with each other, our work will need to be that of a free gift and voluntary work, because our needs will be met through cooperation. Anyway, there's some big thoughts towards the end of this lecture cycle. Hopefully some of that will provoke us to revise some of our foundations of our world. I certainly have found this lecture quite confronting. That's why I've taken some time to comment on it. Anyway, wish you a good day. Cheers.